welcome back in. Today we're discussing some of our favorite Week 14 defenses and as well as some streaming options for you this week. And let's face it, we're going to need it this week with 6 teams on bye. So let's go ahead and get into it. We're going to start things off with our top defenses of the week. And we're going to start with the Minnesota Vikings against the Atlanta Falcons. The Vikings defense continues to be one of the most consistent fantasy defenses this season. They are the only defense this year that is averaging double-digit fantasy points, and they're averaging 10.9 currently. They also currently have the 4th most sacks, the most turnovers, and the 2nd most defensive touchdowns on the year. So the Vikings have been phenomenal. Now they get a revenge narrative matchup with Kirk Cousins coming home to Minnesota. But this really couldn't come at a worse time for Kirk Cousins because he has been terrible the last month. He has thrown 6 INTs, fumbled the ball 4 times, and he has not thrown a single touchdown still over that span. And now you're facing one of the toughest defenses to face in the Minnesota Vikings, one of the most aggressive defenses to face. I think the Minnesota Vikings might have a field day with Kirk Cousins here. So let's keep it moving. We're going to move over to the Eagles now. I'll be honest, this isn't as sexy of a matchup as it was probably a month or two ago with the way that Bryce Young is playing. I do still think, though, the way the Eagles defense is playing, that they can definitely put the clamps on Bryce Young, who has really started to turn the corner as of recently, because let's face it, the Eagles defense is far better than a defense like the Buccaneers that we saw last week. But still, the Eagles have been a pretty consistent defense this year, averaging 7.7 fantasy points per game, which ranks top 12 among all defenses. I'm not expecting some monster performance from this Eagles defense, but I do think that this is a defense that probably can get you 8 to 10 fantasy points this week against the Carolina Panthers. So I'm still okay with playing the Eagles. I just don't have as high expectations as I normally would have, where you probably would have put them as like the number 1 overall defense on the week. So next up, let's move over to the Steelers. The Steelers get a Week 12 rematch in Week 14 against the Browns. The last time these two teams faced, though, the Steelers defense produced 1 sack, 1 INT, 2 fumble recoveries, finished with 7 fantasy points. Weather played a big factor in that game, but this time the Steelers get them at home. The Steelers defense this season has scored 9.9 fantasy points per game, due in large part to creating 25 turnovers this year. The Browns have struggled in allowing pressure as well, as they have yielded the 5th most fantasy points to opposing defenses, making the Steelers a top 3 defense this week. Next up, let's move over to our streaming options of the week, and we're going to start with the Bucs versus the Raiders. The Bucs have been a little bit more of a middle-of-the-road defense this year, due in large part because of their secondary. They also have struggled to get pressure, as they have the 12th lowest pressure rate this year, despite registering the 11th most sacks. They have also been middle of the road in causing turnovers, with a 9.1% turnover rate per offensive drive. However, with all of that being said, the Raiders have allowed the 7th highest pressure rate and the 3rd most fantasy points to defense this year. So I do really like the Bucs this week, especially as whoever the quarterback may be this week. I'm not really all that concerned. I think the Bucs are a pretty decent streaming option this week. Next up is going to be the Saints. The Saints are easily one of the top streaming options this week with the matchup against the Giants on tap. The Giants have allowed the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing defenses this year. This is due in large part because they have struggled to keep their quarterback upright, especially since the loss of Andrew Thomas. The Giants have allowed the 8th highest pressure rate and the 6th most sacks this season, allowing 3.3 per game. With so many teams on bye, the Saints make for a very good streaming option this week. Next up is the Dolphins. The Jets keep finding new ways to fail. Last week, Aaron Rodgers held a 21-7 lead heading into the 2nd quarter. However, that would be all the scoring they did for the rest of the day, as they went on to lose 26-21. Rodgers was sacked 2 times. He also threw a pick 6 to big boy Leonard Williams, who ripped off a 90-plus yard interception return. Things you'll love to see. Next up is a matchup against the Dolphins, who have put up top 12 performances in 3 of their last 4 games. It should set up nicely against the Jets this week. Lastly, we're going to hit on Arizona versus Seattle. The Cardinals continue to be one of the most reliable fantasy defenses. They are currently the DST 11 on the season, with the 9th most sacks and averaging about 7.7 fantasy points per game. Next up is a matchup against the Seahawks. These 2 teams faced 2 weeks ago, and the Cardinals sacked Geno Smith 5 times. They had 1 INT for 11 fantasy points. On the season, though, the Seahawks have allowed the 5th most fantasy points to opposing defenses, making the Cardinals one of the better low-owned streaming options of the week. Now, I will give you a bonus option as well, because I do think on the other side of this game, I think the Seattle Seahawks are also a very live defense to stream this week. The Seahawks actually are the DST 9, averaging 8.7 fantasy points per game as well. The last time these 2 teams faced, the Seahawks produced 6 sacks, 1 INT, and a touchdown for 20 fantasy points in that game, and they were the number 2 overall scoring defense on that week. So I think both of these defenses are definitely live. Both of them are widely available in most leagues. So for Arizona, just because they're at home, but still, I think both these defenses are very good options this week. So that being said, let us know in the comment section below if you have any questions on who you should pick up, who you should drop. We'll see you on the next one. Bye.
We are dreaming in the dark. We are nothing more than dust. Search but you stay lost.